Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Heritage, and I serve as the chair of the New Scholars Committee. We're really delighted to have you here this afternoon for this important program sponsored by the Bibliographical Society of America. The New Scholars Program seeks to promote the work of scholars who are new to the field of bibliography, broadly defined to include any research that deals with the creation, production, publication, distribution, reception, transmission, and subsequent history of textual artifacts, manuscript, print, or digital. Each year, 3 new scholars are selected to present papers to the Society on their current unpublished research in the field of bibliography. In keeping with the values of the Society, the committee welcomes bibliographical scholarship pursuing new methods and new approaches, including applications from candidates applying bibliographical theory and principles to diverse materials and media, something that you're going to see today. In addition, the committee welcomes scholarly submissions that embrace diverse, multicultural perspectives. The program is open to junior, untenured faculty members and graduate students at the dissertation level, and also to professional librarians, members of the book trade, and book collectors who are new to bibliography. If you are an early career scholar who is new to bibliography, I warmly encourage you to apply. Or if you know people who would be interested in applying to the program, please bring this opportunity to their attention. More information is available on the BSA website. I would like to thank the members of this year's selection committee for their valuable expertise, and they really are the heart of this program. These people include Cynthia Gibson, and if they could stand, Cynthia, Melissa Mead, Jim Green, and Simran Tadani, who cannot be here. But please give them a round of applause because they really do a lot of work. The program is supported through the generosity of a number of contributors. And there are 2 named awards, as you will hear, that are given to our new scholars. BSA's Malkin New Scholar Award was established through a contribution in memory of Marianne O'Brien Malkin, well known to many as a longtime contributor to Antiquarian Bookman and A.B. Bookman's Weekly, edited by Saul Malkin, her husband. Mary Ann was one of the foremost collectors of books on dance, and many of you will have seen her catalog, which is remarkable. The Malkin New Scholar Award is made to candidates working in the fields of the antiquarian book trade, dance, and/or Americana. We would like to encourage potential new scholars working in these fields to apply. And this year, that award has gone to Alison Fraser, who will be speaking to you. BSA's Pantzer New Scholar Award was created through a bequest by Catherine F. Pantzer, establishing an award that really recognizes bibliography. She herself, Catherine Pantzer, was best known for her work on the revised short title catalog of books printed in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and of English books printed abroad 1475 to 1640. The Pantzer Award is made to new scholars working in the fields of bibliography with a preference for descriptive bibliography and work on English imprints through 1640. Elisa Tersigni, seated here, is going to be presenting today as this year's Pantzer Scholar. I am pleased to announce that in addition to these 2 named awards, an anonymous donor has underwritten our 3rd New Scholars Award. Matt, your sponsor is anonymous. But we are grateful still for their contribution. And I would like to announce that George Ong has generously agreed to provide additional support for the programming in its upcoming year. George is going to be increasing the award we make to our new scholars from $500 to $1,000. And George has also offered to extend the new scholars' complimentary BSA membership from 1 to 3 full years. We are deeply grateful to George and to our underwriter, who is anonymous, for these contributions to our program. Please give them a round of applause. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn our attention to this year's new scholars who are going to present their papers to us. We are delighted to welcome Alison Fraser, Elisa Tersigni, and Matthew Wills to BSA. Dr. Fraser is presenting her paper to you as this year's Malkin Scholar, as I had mentioned. She is as you're going to hear, doing a lot of exciting work on the intersection of poetics, new media, and gender, delving into the ways that media technology influences poetics and how poets respond to new developments in media. Elisa Tersigni's presentation draws on traditional bibliographical methods, such as watermark analysis and collation, along with new bibliographical technological methods, such as biocodicology. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, you'll find out. Matthew Will's paper breaks new ground with respect to an underrepresented bibliographical topic, the production of Chinese paper within the context of propaganda and state publishing. His paper tracks late 20th century technological experiments with pulp and paper production, as the Chinese paper industry tried to stretch production to meet new government demands. So the larger theme of this year's meeting is technology, and as you heard, each of these papers is going to be delving into technology in different ways. I'm very excited to bring you these three presenters, and I ask that you hold your questions until the end of their presentations, when we'll have a Q&A. So, Alison, please.
First, I really want to say thank you to everybody for coming and to making us feel so welcome. Thank you especially to Barbara and Aaron for being supportive through this whole process, and it's really exciting to finally be here, and it's a real pleasure to talk alongside Elisa and Matthew. So my talk surveys, in as much as possible in 15 minutes, the intersections between poetics, new media, and gender, and asks in what ways media technology impacts poetics, and in what ways poets respond to new developments in media technology. The answers to these questions enlarge the scope of book history to include 20th century ephemeral print production and provide an alternative narrative to the development of postmodernist poetics. So I argue for a feminist redetermination of what we consider to be valuable to the study of bibliography, widening its scope to include ephemeral homemade books like scrapbooks, photograph albums, and xerography or photocopying, in which print technology and poetic inspiration intersect. The homemade quality of ephemeral objects positions them outside of the traditional publication marketplace and its attendant critics, locating them inside private, domestic spaces of production. This talk demonstrates how these poets responded to and manipulated emerging forms of media, like Helen Adams' occult scrapbooks, Laurie Niedeker's vacation photograph albums, or Susan Howe's Xerox compositions, in their multidisciplinary approaches to poetry in the book. Refuting the long-standing assumption that the modern collage poem, which was one of the most influential contributions of literary modernism, was developed exclusively from the male avant-garde, I argue that these poets' engagement with homemade ephemeral books makes legible an increased sensitivity to the page as a visual staging ground for writing, and speaks to concerns in postmodern literature, including visual poetics, intertextuality, and the tension between narrativity and fragmentation. Homemade books also speak to technological developments in print production in the 20th century, and in particular, anxieties arising in publishing thanks to the development of xerography. Xerography is bringing a reign of terror to the world of publishing, Marshall McLuhan wrote with dismay in 1966, because it means that every reader can become both author and publisher. So as a case study, my talk is going to focus on Susan Howe's Xerox Poetics, starting typical collage compositions from Frolic Architecture, before describing her archival research in Pierce Arrow, and finally a bibliography of the King's Book, or Icon Basilica. These three brief examples demonstrate some of the ways that her Xerox compositions draw attention to the book's status as an assembled object with its own possibilities for manipulated materiality. In the late decades of the 20th century, new media technologies, first mimeograph, then photocopying, and then finally digital, had progressed so that amateur publishers could produce publications that could circulate within a community and replace the need for traditional publication outlets. Of course, the revolutionary fact of xerography is that you don't actually need to know how photocopying works to make a photocopy, and the only tool that you need is the machine itself. Unlike Mimeo, copies can be made from literally anything. At the same time, the labor behind 20th century mass print was female. The automation, or increasingly female, the automation of print production demanded unskilled, underappreciated, and underpaid labor, Women sat on the benches of clippings bureaus in the early 20th century, and of course copied office documents on photocopiers from the mid-century to today. By the 1960s, photocopying machines have become essential tools in office workplaces and were operated almost invariably by women, as Pamela Pfeiffer observes. Women's work came to signify not only housework, but also menial clerical jobs that included making copies of the boss's originals. The structure of the family home was replicated within the publishing house, and in publishing, Laura Furman explained in 1970, women are kept in the home. A family chart of most houses would place white males at the highest levels, at least of decision-making, because men are the owners, the managers, and the top editors. But if they brought xerography out of the office and into their homes, women could transform themselves into bookmakers making books for themselves. Xerography was a revolutionary tool not only in publishing, but also, of course, in archives and libraries as part of a suite of reproduction tools that helped librarians distribute collections and protect fragile documents. However, xerography complicates the idea of uniqueness, which is essential to archives. So for instance, in his 1956 book, Modern Archives, which was the textbook for several generations of archivists, T.R. Schellenberg argues that the value of records is directly proportional to their uniqueness. So not only do the copies of records have diminished value, but also the originals themselves, which have been copied. The fetish for uniqueness is rooted in exclusivity, and a unique object can be difficult to access, requiring credentials or supervision or other barriers. So what can xerography mean for book publishing or archives? So one answer comes from the artist turned poet Susan Howe, who used xerography in the first few decades of her poetic practice, not only as an aid to compose the collaged, chaotic pages for which she is known, but also to create opportunities for disrupting historical narratives. Howe's xerographic process does not involve making photocopied books, but rather challenging the form of the book and the exclusivity of archives, exploring new possibilities for poetic bibliography. Throughout her work, she is motivated by questions of archival silences, histories, and books in libraries, particularly as they relate to suppressed female voices. And her investment in integrating process and publication is revealed in her poems' xerographic materiality, in their fragmentation and complex visual forms. So put in the very simplest terms, Howe's process is to make copies of archives and then make copies of her copies to publish in books. And with each step of Howe's xerographic poetics, the idea of the original, the unique, or the individual becomes complicated, erased, and reinforced. In Frolic Architecture, which you see some pages from here, Howe's xerographic poetics imitates plate tectonics, and lines of poetry are subsumed and superimposed upon each other through the layering process of photocopying. Faint physical reminders of this undistinguished office application remain on the page. Reflecting in Pierce Arrow, she writes, "The invisible Scotch tape I recently used when composing Frolic Architecture leaves traces on the paper when I run each original sheet through the Canon copier." The result is a small clutch of fragmented, interrupted lines that can barely be read. A transcription of the poem is only partially possible, as cross-cutting textual elements erase and superimpose themselves, cutting in and out of visibility. In this example, French, Latin, and English collide, and like in plate tectonics, overlaid photocopies meet at convergent boundaries where subduction subsumes the other. This distortion and loss echoes the source text that Howe was using for Frolic Architecture, which are the private writings of Hannah Edwards Wetmore, which were copied by her daughter and which are now part of the Jonathan Edwards papers at the Beinecke. Where language or clarity is lost in subduction, the formation of new textual possibilities arises. And scholars have done a lot of work on these kinds of compositions, so I won't spend too much time on it. But critics like Alan Golding, Michael Davidson, Rachel Blau-Duplessis, Rachel Bach, and Mandy Bloomfield have argued that compositions like these do violence to Howe's source text through the political act of rendering pages illegible. This composition technique goes against xerography's original goal of producing legible copies, and also, I think, gives dignity to the faceless work of office secretaries by promoting labor frequently labeled as drudgery to the status of literature and art. Howe's use of xerography extends beyond a tool to facilitate her collage poetics. In her book, Pierce Arrow, Howe explores the ways in which xerography releases historical documents from the archives and allows her to possess the archives in her home, creating what Lisa Giltman has described as a modest site of self-possession. The book opens with Howe in an out-of-the-way room in the Sterling Library at Yale University. So she writes, "During the summer of 1997, I spent many hours in New Haven in the bowels of Sterling Library because that's where the microform room is, almost underground, next to preservation. In an adjoining, more crypt-like corridor, behind some discarded, hopelessly outdated computer terminals and microphone viewers, nothing outside or inside will ever be seen on them again. The 38-reel Charles S. Pierce papers, 1859 to 1913, inclusive microform film MISC 948, is packed inside 2 drawers of a slate-gray metal file cabinet. No one stays for long in this passage or chamber because it's freezing, and the noise of the air conditioning generators the university recently installed in a sub-basement immediately underneath resembles roaring or loud sobbing." The room at the Sterling, it is implied, is designed to be unappealing, and while access is granted, it is in some ways been given begrudgingly. The goal is that no one stays for long. I do want to say, no offense to my colleagues at Yale, and also Howe speaks very positively to other physical spaces in their libraries. Women, Howe notes, are excluded from this space even if they are crucial to its existence. The Charles S. Pierce papers exist because of Pierce's wife, but Howe tells us the arrangers, catalogers, editors, and custodians don't give Juliet's name. And I think we can all find examples of that in our own collections. Howe's impulse to situate her reader immediately on the margins of the library communicates her concerns regarding access, communication, and the representation of documents and records, and underscores the transformative power of photocopying archival material for later private home use. Her description of researching in the microform room, from which she could then make copies she would take home, juxtaposes with her description in her book, That This, which was published 11 years later, of writing Pierce Arrow in her home in Buffalo, New York. She writes, "I have been reading Xerox copies of the last journal pages from the microfilm edition of the manuscripts of Charles Sanders Peirce. I remember the way the lines of the poem C.O. Milford, P.A., 1904, came to me suddenly after reading the journal, and how quiet it seemed inside the room with soft snow falling outside." Possessing the Xeroxed archival manuscripts in her home, Howe's relationship to them transforms from one of a policed, put-upon viewer in a hostile environment to a free owner in the comfort of her own home. It is in this domestic space that she can incorporate Xerox material into her writing and create modest sites of self-possession. The Sterling Library also provided Howe with a bibliography of the King's Book, or Icon Basilica, by Edward Almec, which her son found in a book sale where the library was, as she puts it, getting rid of useless books. Of course, purportedly written by King Charles I while imprisoned before his execution, Icon Basilica was continually suppressed and censored, and although its printers, Howe notes, were hunted down and imprisoned, it was yet set into type time and again. During 1649, fresh editions appeared almost daily and sold out at once. The irrepressibility of the text foreshadows the irrepressibility of text in the age of photocopying. As Lisa Giltman has argued, Xeroxing documents can become a political act where a document is copied so many times that it cannot be suppressed. In Icon Basilica, in each edition, parts were added and subtracted as printers recreated and redistributed the work. The most controversial was a poem that Charles was said to have had in his pocket as he walked to the gallows, written by a pagan woman named Pamela. Her sections were frequently excluded. So, like a serious student, Howe begins her book with the dictionary definition of a bibliographer, writing, one that writes about or is informed about books, their authorship, format, publication, and similar details. And then Howe continues, is he or she supposed to compile a set of authoritative texts that can withstand the charge of forgery, the test of time, the timelessness of libraries? A bibliography, and here she's quoting another definition, a bibliography is the history, identification, or analytical and systematic description or classification of writers or publications considered as material objects. Can we ever discover the original text? Was there ever an original poem? Was there a pure text invented by an author? Is such a conception possible? Howe's work destabilizes and reshapes the goals of bibliography by pointing to new hypertextual dimensions for the book. And of course, she's not alone in the 20th century in doing this. Throughout, Howe makes her work difficult for future bibliographers, as Peter Quarterman has noticed. The title page, which we saw a minute ago, which appears several pages into the book after her introduction and after a poem, is a facsimile of Edward Almec's, with his name crossed out and how is placed below. The pages of the book are unnumbered, and of course the book is composed from these collaged, Xeroxed lines from the source text. Questioning bibliography is embedded into the text itself. When she writes in the book's introduction, can we ever discover the original text? Was there ever an original poem? What is a pure text invented by an author? She is at once referencing the complicated bibliographical history of Icon Basilica, and in particular the suppressed poem and sections by Pamela, as well as her own creative process. Composing her bibliography by Xeroxing pages of Icon Basilica and then cutting and pasting them into poem collages, Howe's process shows the impossibility of the original text of locating authorial intention. Of Pamela, Howe writes, "She is the blank page, writing ghost writing." In Xerography, as Howe's work shows, new developments in media technology open up new possibilities for poetics and call into question what we consider to be the labor of making, refocusing our attention to process when we consider the product or the book. By utilizing Xerography, Howe creates sites of self-possession that confront history, materiality, and the publishing marketplace. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to be providing more complete biographical information about our speakers before our Q&A. Right now, I want to invite Elisa Tersigni up for her paper, which she's going to present. And the paper's title is Two Sides of the Same Book, The Creation and Use of Early Modern English Recipe Books.
First, I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me to tell you about my research on the receipt book collection at the Folger Shakespeare Library, so thank you. I'm the Digital Research Fellow for the Folger's 3-year, $1.5 million Mellon-funded grant in collaborative research entitled Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. This grant was built around our collection of early modern English manuscript receipt books, which is the largest such collection in the world. It is currently comprised of approximately 125 manuscripts, and we are actively collecting more. We're almost halfway through the project right now, so this is very much work in progress, and I'm very open to any suggestions that you have. A large portion of the BFT project includes transcribing and encoding of the receipt books to produce a corpus, which we will make available digitally for anyone to use. To transcribe, we use our browser-based transcription software, Romeo, which you can see here, and we use transcribathons to crowdsource transcriptions, which then get vetted by our volunteers who are expert paleographers, and then we encode those transcriptions with the intention of using them for large-scale analysis of text. My research combines large-scale text analysis with bibliographic analysis to study authorship, and particularly women's writing. So when I was hired as the Digital Research Fellow for BFT, I promptly took to bibliographic analysis on this receipt book collection as a complement to the digital study. Before I continue, I just wanted to quickly define what I mean by the term receipt book. The term essentially refers to what we now call recipe books, although sometimes they were also used as account books, and so the term can be a bit ambiguous. Receipt books are largely an untapped resource and have been overlooked for several reasons. Food studies is a relatively new field that has bloomed only in the past few decades. Within that field, little attention has been given to receipt books, and that's only been in approximately the last decade or so. This is in part because receipt books were owned and compiled by women, and usually anonymous women, and women's writing has historically been overlooked. Furthermore, as compilations of recipes and narratives rather than original texts, receipt books have been considered less desirable and more problematic. But their complexity is also what makes them rich artifacts and textual sources. These books are abundant with information about the history of globalization and the food trade, networks of people and information, and the relationship between manuscript and print. As the precursor to the modern recipe book, early modern receipt books also tell us a lot about the professionalization of cooking and pharmacy and the evolution of the recipe genre. Some of the scholars whose work I'm attempting to build on includes Elaine Leung, Anne Blair, and Wendy Wall. The title of this talk is inspired by a codex in the Folger Shakespeare Library's collection. This codex has 2 front covers. Depending on how one reads the book, the front cover either reads instructions in cookery or medical. The book reminded me of a dos-à-dos binding, which comes from French meaning back-to-back. These bindings were common in early modern England and usually comprised of either of a New Testament and a Psalter. The Folger's manuscript is not a proper dos-à-dos. It's a single codex that is constructed to be read in two different ways. Reading from one direction finds cookery recipes, and from the other, medical recipes. Heather Wolf has proposed that we use the term tête bêche, which is French for head to tail, to describe receipt books in this configuration, and has proposed that our catalogers add this format to the notes field of our catalog records. The Folger's catalogers will be working on getting this term established as a form term in the standard vocabularies. One of the challenges that we found in working with a genre that is understudied is that we have to work to document the conventions and create the appropriate vocabulary so that this material can be more easily found and studied in future. I thought that I would give you a broad overview of our collection, including some of the preliminary data that I've collected. While this slide represents only 9 of our books, you can get a sense of the variety of bindings and formats of our receipt books. The bindings are paper, leather, parchment. Sometimes they have metal clasps or silk and parchment ties. They include stamping and blind and gold tooling. The formats include traditional folios, quartos, and octavos, as well as oblong quartos. There are 2 exceptional formats in our collection, both on this slide, one here and one here. They're the horizontal oblong quarto and the vertical oblong quarto. There are several challenges when attempting to compile basic data about receipt books. One of the challenges is that the authorship of the materials is very unclear. For one, the identity of the compiler is not always known, nor is it always clear from where the individual recipes derive. These 2 factors don't even begin to contend with how one defines the authorship of a recipe, so when a recipe is new or old. Compounding these issues is the fact that receipt books were extremely valuable objects that were handed down over many generations. So dating a receipt book is challenging, and therefore trying to draw broad conclusions about historical trends in the genre is very difficult. Not all of our receipt books have identities or marks identifying the compilers of the books, but if they do have identifications, those happen on the first leaf or the paste down or the inside of the front cover. As you can see from these marks, some, like Constance Hall's, are quite elaborate and prominent, and others, like Andrew Slee's, are more discreet. His is right here. Some of the research questions I have include, were the compilers of receipt books designing and curating them from conception to execution? Were they simply compiling useful information and notes that over time came to resemble a receipt book? Was the constructing of a receipt book used as a form of education for young women in which they learned domestic literacies? The mise en page of these books can tell us a lot about the intentions of the compiler. Some of the books include ruling, decoration, and multiple colors of ink. Some of the receipt books appear to have been pre-planned, with elaborate ruling and information categorization being written into the structure of the book. In these cases, the receipt book not only contain practical information, but are demonstrations of sophisticated understandings of design and information. Other receipt books appear chaotic, with writing in all different directions and no clear sense of order of information. In these cases, the receipt books seem to function more as storage containers than as aesthetic objects. Many of the receipt books include information organization strategies, such as alphabetically organized indices. Some of these books appear to have been planned to include indices from conception, but others had added indices much later. The manuscript on the right side of the screen was rebound with an index much later. This index not only subsequently divided the recipes to separate the medical and the cookery recipes, which are listed in 2 separate indices, but those indices are also organized alphabetically, and within each letter are subdivided into broad foodstuffs categories. The way in which information is organized gestures towards a very different food culture from that which we have today. For instance, recipes today are often divided into sweet and savory. Here, the resultant taste, sweet or savory, is not distinguished, but the method of preparation is distinguished. The index on the left, that is very different. It's organized according to the first letter of the title of the recipe, which isn't necessarily helpful because some of those titles start with nouns and some start with adjectives. You might be wondering what a typical early modern English manuscript receipt book looks like. This is some of the preliminary data that I put together. The exact numbers will change a bit over time. And of course, our collection only represents that which is extant. Right now, the most common book format in the collection is the quarto. I'm not quite sure why this is the dominant format. It could be that this is a particularly versatile format, which is fairly easy to handle and write in if a compiler is writing within a codex and not on loose sheets that are folded and subsequently bound. Anecdotally speaking, I would say that the more elaborately designed receipt books are those that are folio format, and the less elaborately designed ones are octavos. My suspicion is that many recipes were recorded on loose sheets that are no longer extant, and so these are likely underrepresented in the figures. That many of these receipt books appear in a standard format and in the convenient quarto format suggests to me that they were pre-bound notebooks that were purchased rather than sheets that were later bound. The watermark analysis I've completed supports this hypothesis as the watermarks remain consistent throughout a codex. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to identify the authorship of a receipt book. Nonetheless, I attempted to calculate how many of these books had evidence of being produced by women and how many had evidence of being produced by men. About half the books have no clear mark, and those that do have an ownership mark are usually women. I attempted to subdivide the genre of receipt books into medical or cookery, and vaguely speaking, early modern receipt books tended to differentiate between these two genres. In the same way that the Tet Besh I showed at the beginning has one side that's labeled cookery and one that's labeled medical. This differentiation is very problematic because medicine and cookery overlap significantly in the period, but half of the receipt books were self-defined as cookery and another quarter, approximately cookery and medical mixed. Where both the compiler's name and the subgenre was clear, men's tended to be medical and women's tended to be cookery or mixed. In reading the text, one gets a sense of how textual information is compiled, which, especially in the case of receipt books, relates to how the physical object is constructed. I'm going to walk through one of our recipe books, WA 318, as a case study of how reading for internal evidence complements the bibliographical study of the artifact. Compilers of recipes sometimes note their sources. For instance, in this receipt book, the woman compiling says, quote, "The following receipts are taken from my mother's book and are certainly very good." In the same book, the recipes also note whether the compiler's mother has taken the extra step of marking a recipe as notably good. In receipt books, these marks of approval often were noted with the phrase probatum est, which is Latin for it has been proved or it has been tested, as is written here in this formula for life found in a different receipt book in the Folger's collection. While I haven't yet counted the proportions, I can anecdotally say that marks of disapproval are more common than those of approval. On the right is an example of a not good recipe, and on the left, a user has taken pains to cross out a recipe and say this receipt is good for nothing. The compiler of WA 318 has not only copied from her mother's own manuscript receipt book, but also from Jill's book, what I have known her to use with great credit in our family. While these two attributions indicate that the compiler's sources are physically copied from other people's books, other attributions suggest that not all sources are textual. In the note for another recipe, the compiler writes, "Mama saith, I used to give this to my servant in case of a cold." This note suggests that the compiler is not just copying from her mother's book, but is engaging in a dialogue with her mother as she copies from the book and transcribes those oral notes as textual ones. Other recipes relay information that has been orally transmitted from her mother. In a list of cures for nosebleeds, one begins, "My mama has been told by those who have experienced them." Another recipe is cited as having been approved by her cousin Passwater. The compiler is copying from a variety of sources, textual and oral, and adding notes of approval from the recipe's points of origin. These textual notes aid in recreating the process of authorship, information gathering, and book construction. Some of the most interesting narratives are also the most subtle ones, including narratives of family and national history. Recipe number 70 is marked as having cured the compiler's father of jaundice. Recipe 42, a recipe for portable soup, or what we would now call a bouillon cube, concludes by saying, "This will hold good on East India voyage." There is also potential to read autobiography within the text. The medical half of the receipt book begins with recipes for burns and fevers that are ascribed to various doctors and women. These seem to be typical recipes that would have been necessary in any household, especially ones with a hearth instead of modern cooking appliances, where burns would have been common. Beginning at recipe number 150, a little more than halfway through the medical recipes, the compiler begins collecting recipes for preventing miscarriage, followed by recipes for drinks to take after delivery and cures for flooding, i.e. uterine hemorrhage. After the last of the lying-in recipes comes a recipe for an ointment to cure sore nipples, referencing painful early days of breastfeeding. After these recipes for pregnancy and afterbirth, recipes for children begin to appear until the last leaf, which concludes with a recipe to take down the great belly of a child. One might infer from the order of these recipes an autobiographical story. The compiler begins by recording the most basic recipes necessary for an early modern household, and then adds recipes as they were necessary during pregnancy, birth, afterbirth, and caring for children. I wish I had more opportunity to show you more examples of these fascinating palimpsestic documents, but I'll just quickly mention that we're working really hard on getting all of these digitized. About 85 are already available online, and the other 15% we expect to have done by the end of the year. You can find it on this website. I'll conclude very briefly just to tell you about one of the future avenues of study that I'm particularly interested in taking, or particularly excited in taking. I'll be collaborating with Dr. Sarah Fittiment at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Fittiment is a bioarchaeologist who focuses on parchment analysis. You might be familiar with her work on the York Gospels. She'll be helping us to determine the composition of stains in our recipe books by using protein analysis. We have a few books in our collection with stains, but I'm also finding more with the help of UV light, which can help spot where organic material once lay. There's a lot of work left to be done, but I hope this project will serve as an example of how various bibliographic methodologies, both old and new, including watermark analysis, writing of collation statements, and biocodicology, can complement other methodologies such as large-scale text analysis and close reading to answer complicated research questions and tell nuanced narratives. Thank you.
Our last presenter is Matthew Wills, who's going to be telling us about the paper crisis and the scramble for stability in Mao-Era publishing. Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me here, and it's so great to be following two such fantastic presentations. I'm talking about something very different. I'm talking about a paper crisis in Mao's China. The starting point for my entire dissertation research, of which this is one part, was thinking about a propaganda state very dependent on print for political communication. How does that actually work? How do you actually do all of those things? How do you get the books to people logistically? All of these kind of elements. China is a particularly interesting case because it's so large. So the quantity of books we're dealing with here is astronomically large compared to, say, something like other paperback publishers like Penguin, or even ones in the United States, and this introduces its own quirks. My way into this is through looking at a campaign in the 1970s called the Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius campaign. Now, what was that campaign? Very simply put, Lin Biao, Chairman Mao's former number 2, had tried to flee the country in somewhat mysterious circumstances and was rebranded as a traitor. At the same time, Confucius and Confucianism were being branded by the Communist Party as a very regressive philosophy. In 1974, criticism of these two individuals came together in the form of this campaign to, at the same time, criticize Lin Biao and criticize Confucius. It's kind of bizarre. I can't really go into it now, but that's all we need to know for now. So print is very, very politicized in China at this time. Here's an interesting example of this from a children's book, a poem called Little Lead Type. Each piece of type, like a bullet in a gun, locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Aim at Lin and the philosopher Kong, that's Confucius. The victory banner flies higher and higher. And here you see some children holding little type blocks with the type heads spelling out the name of this campaign. Here's another quote. The printing industry is a propaganda tool for the party and serves Chairman Mao's proletarian revolutionary line. It's a productive industry, but more importantly, it is also a political industry. So printing was very important. Publishers faced a lot of pressure to get on board with the new campaign, produce printed material that would both explain it, because it was kind of unfathomable putting these two individuals together, and also spread its narratives around the country. To do this requires a lot of paper, which is what I'm here to talk about today. Now, looking at this graph, things kind of look pretty good in the 70s. You can see around the middle is we're in 1974 to 1976. That's the key period for me. You can see from 1970 that paper production, in particular paper used for book publishing, which is shown in the orange line, is growing. So there's these rising production figures. So at first glance, this looks like a healthy situation to be in. But then what's not shown on this graph, and is the origins of kind of the Mao-Era paper crisis, is the skyrocketing demand for paper in China at this time. Because publishers individually face all of this pressure from their senior levels, the people overseeing culture at the provincial level and the state level, they want to publish a lot of books. Because China has no copyright law, material can be duplicated easily and en masse. So, for example, in 1970, there are 1,843 politics titles published in China. About 900 of those simply copy word-for-word information out of the newspaper, and this amounts to around 912 million volumes is the estimate they put on it. So there's this is very normal practice. This creates a huge amount of demand for paper. 912 million volumes is around 42,000 tons paper. So these are big numbers. There's also unofficial publishing, what I call the proliferation of blandness, where every work unit, every society, like this society, for example, the equivalent in China would be producing its own political material in-house in order to show their support for this political campaign. This leads to enormous amount of what is technically illegal publishing, because it's not coming out of state publishers, and produces scenes like this. This is from my own collection, and these are all books published unofficially. This is also a huge draw on paper, and these people, these organizations, these factories, these societies are competing with publishers for precious paper stocks. And very finally, public money is freely available to be used to buy books. So factories and other organizations can stock up their local in-work unit library with money provided by the state without any kind of oversight. And so there's a huge customer base, effectively, for materials as well. The other side to this is huge production shortfalls at this time. Now, an estimate in 1977 puts the deficit of publishing paper in China at 190,000 tons, the production deficit between 1973 and 1976. To give you some kind of context, that's 4 times the 42,000 needed for the 912 million books. That's also twice what publishers were allocated in 1974 for all book publishing nationwide in China. So there's a huge amount of underproduction. The reasons for this are very interesting, and mostly to involve deficits in supplies of raw materials. Wood, or the pulp that derives from it, is the most important. There isn't a guaranteed kind of a supply chain of pulp that are coming into paper mills, and this means that effectively paper mills are unable to produce their kind of inherent production capacity. This is interesting because they start experimenting with other things. So they start experimenting with any form of kind of agricultural organic matter that you could find in the field. So this includes reeds, this includes the husks that you might get off corn, all these various things. They also start chopping down trees by the side of the road in Beijing to try and find, because that's good poplar wood that is just lying there unclaimed. So if you look at books from the period, I can't show you today, but you get a whole spectrum of colors of the paper you see, and you can see the various types of organic material if you look at the pages. So it's a real kind of period of experimentation driven by this chronic production shortfalls. There's also an interesting dynamic where they try and make more with less. They try and make paper thinner and make it less sturdy, but still good enough to be usable. So they cut, for example, the weight of paper, or the mass of paper used for front covers, from 110 grams per meter squared to 90 grams per meter squared. This causes a lot of complaints from readers where their covers suddenly start tearing in the mail, or this kind of development. So these material changes that they're making, which is being driven by the shortfalls, are having implications for how people are perceiving the state. So really, towards the end of the Mao-Era, paper production in China and the publishing sector is kind of limping home to the finish. That's one of the titles of my dissertation chapters. This is not a triumphant kind of period by any means. I'm now going to talk about how we can see this in Beijing People's Press, one of the foremost publishers in China at the time. This graph, you don't need to absorb all of this graph. I'll explain it in a little bit in a moment. So, tracking the activities of Beijing People's Press through its archives, and these are one of the few publishing archives currently available to researchers in China, allows us to see the shortage of paper having a direct effect on how publishers are operating and propaganda production in China. So initially, at the beginning of 1974, as the campaign launched, this press, Beijing People's Press, is producing books in print runs of 50 to 200,000, producing a lot of them, mass dissemination. They plan a further 21 titles in February 1974 of print runs of 100,000 each. So they're starting with fairly expansive levels because the consequences of the crisis haven't quite bit at this point. At the same time, however, there's a very interesting document which I found from February where they're asked to report their average kind of in-house paper reserve in warehouses to the state. And the answer for Beijing is 0. So they're basically living kind of hand to mouth even at this time. By 1973, however, you start to see cutting of print runs because they literally do not have the paper coming out of the paper mills and being delivered to the presses in order to print what they want to print. So, for example, on this table, lots of the print runs stay the same. However, for one title, this one, 5 down, Legalists of the Spring and Autumn Warring States Period, which is not a fascinating read, I can tell you that. The print run they want is 400,000. The print run they can do is 100,000. Another title about 2/3 of the way down, the print run is cut by 50,000. And although the print run for one title is expanded, if you kind of calculate how much paper is being used, they're down by about 10,000 reams or so. So this is kind of the paper deficit that they're experiencing, the amount they're having to kind of cancel in terms of production. By April 1975, things have got even worse because they very much have a short-term mindset because they always have to respond to short-term political pressure from the boss, the boys upstairs, and it is all men, the boys upstairs kind of wanting to see more and more books in bookstores. And so by April 1975, they're due to get 68,000 reams of paper for the year from the state. They've already spent 40,000 plus of that committed, and that's 1/3 of the way through the year, and they're facing this huge kind of deficit. They asked the state, can you give us twice what you've already promised us for the year? And the state central planners, who are being inundated with these requests from across the country, say, no, we cannot, because we don't have any of these problems. What's interesting, though, is at this point, the dual dynamic is that this is paper that hasn't even been delivered yet. So the state has said, we're promising you 68,000 reams for the year, but that paper is going to come in gradually. So factories, month by month, because they were consistently missing deliveries, publishers were essentially kind of banking on having paper that never showed up at presses. So this caused kind of this short-term perspective, and then the fact that the crisis kept getting worse and worse eventually was leading to them kind of making drastic cuts to print runs almost on the fly. They were also very frustrated. There's an interesting, paper is extremely valuable in China because it's so scarce. So there's a lot of inter-bureaucratic stress, which is interesting to read about in documents. So for example, in the nearby city of Tianjin, which is about an hour's drive or so from Beijing, it also has a publisher, but not a substantial one, nothing like Beijing People's Press. But Tianjin has managed to back-channel to get more paper allocated to it by central government planners who are divvying up the resources. So then Beijing writes this letter of complaint, which for Mao-Era administrative discourse, this is quite forthright. This is not normally how you interact with your higher levels, where they're essentially complaining and they're saying, you know, Beijing is a publishing center, we're getting far less than Tianjin. So what we need to imagine here is that every provincial and central publisher, although they're part of a kind of unified state system, are all having to fight their own corner to guarantee their own supplies of material. And whoever has the best contacts, does the best back-channeling, et cetera, will come out on top. So it's quite a tense situation. And then what a difference 2 years can make. This is publishing for the campaign in the first quarter of 1976. Look at these figures. We've dropped from seeing many zeros to 2,000, 3,000. There's 10,000 of an image, and the top print run there is 30,000 for a book aimed at children and kind of young adults in particular. This is a huge amount of contraction in what the state has tried to do. And essentially, you end up with a campaign that just kind of fizzles out, and the reason for it, or one of the reasons, is this paper crisis, where by 1976, they have huge amounts of production deficit. Things are getting worse and worse. This is such an interesting story to read about in the research. Let me tell you why. 3 things. First of all, what you see happening for books also happens for newspapers, and so newspapers are also living kind of like this perilous existence in China at this time. Secondly, it helps us see political campaigns as winding down, not only due to political will, but also due to a lack of materials. And thirdly, if they had had more paper, they would have printed more. Historians in modern Chinese studies, we already think of China as a propaganda state because they produced millions, billions of books. But with the right materials, they would have produced even more. So what we think we know about the intended size of the propaganda state is not actually what they were thinking. It was just constrained by materials. Thank you.
So now I'd like to invite our presenters to come up for Q&A. And as they come up here, I'm going to just give you very quickly a little more background about them. Dr. Fraser, here, who addressed us, is an assistant curator of the poetry collection and interim curator of the rare book and special collection at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York. And what you heard today is part of a larger manuscript in process called Homemade Books, a 20th Century Literary History. Dr. Tersigni here is a digital research fellow for Perform Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures, which is a Mellon-funded initiative at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And as you can see, that really is informing a lot of her work. Matthew is a 6-year PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego. And he's not only finishing up a doctoral dissertation, but assembling a really fine collection of Chinese books. So I'm guessing that some of those images we saw, Matthew, are from your private collection. So it contains your collection contains 7,800 items, and Matthew recently won first place in the National Collegiate Book Collecting Contest. So I know there are a number of book collectors in the room who might be interested in asking you questions about your work and collecting. But I want to kick off the conversation first by just meditating a little bit more on the role of technology in each of your presentations. I think we saw in Matthew's paper a really excellent demonstration of how printing is a form of technology and how the vagaries of printing really do affect what we can print and the output. We have with Alison an example of an artist who's really responding and reappropriating in really interesting ways a new technology for reproducing work and turning it on its head and thinking about what that means, especially with respect to ideas about bibliography itself. So we're thinking about bibliography both topically and as a kind of a new technology for bookmaking. And finally, Elisa is suggesting that her work is going to be advanced in ways by new tools for working on receipt/recipe books with technologies. And I would like to ask you, in terms of all of these different approaches, we have historical and methodological and practical concerns. How are these shaped? How has your work been shaped by larger conversations in the humanities about technology and bibliography?
Thank you very much, Robert. Is this on?
Should be,
okay.
Yeah.
Really an interesting question. I mean, for me, one thing that's interesting is, of course, new media is really relative, and this hand press era was once new media, whereas xerography is now not so much new media, but it was not so long ago. And to me, I think what draws me into this from the larger conversations in the humanities is thinking about the everyday and how that impacts poetics and the ways in which a poet is not just writing their poetry but also responding to or thinking about the ways that their work is going to appear and charting that. For instance, in Howe's work, she's very explicit. I mean, she spends a lot of her books with the kind of collage compositions that we saw, but a lot of the big quotes that I read, this paratext, this meditation on her process that's also part of the poetry. So there's an increased conversation around expanding genres and dismantling boundaries and silos in the different humanities fields that I think is really applicable to the ways that technology is being used in poetics.
One of the interesting things about growing up in a time when we're switching from print to digital is it makes me think a lot about the switch from manuscript to print. And new technology was very evident in my talk when I was talking about bibliography and large-scale text analysis. But one of the narratives I didn't really get to talk about is the relationship between manuscript and print in these receipt books. And we have cases where we have entire receipt books that were copied from a printed book. And a lot of the receipts actually come from printed materials, not from manuscript materials. And so I think sometimes we have the assumption that it goes from manuscript to print, whereas receipt books sort of undermine that assumption by going from print to manuscript.
In terms of me, in modern Chinese history, the lack of attention to bibliographic kind of considerations, it's very popular for pre-industrial Chinese printing. There's a lot of scholarship on that, but less so. So this got me more interested in why nobody was talking about this in respect to propaganda. But then I really learned a lot by reading a lot of kind of Western bibliography. Even I read things on the first folio Shakespeare, and just thinking about the paper, that's what got me interested in these kind of considerations. And another thing I do is testing the thickness of individual pages, and that's the idea for that, and thinking about paper quality from that perspective came from looking at what bibliographers do with micrometers on books published in rare books published in the West. So I think that's quite exciting to be making that kind of bridge.
Thank you. Cynthia Gibson, Vice Chair of our committee, is now going to bring around a microphone. So I hope if you have questions, you'll raise your hand. And we have a wonderful array here of work covering lots of periods. I see a question back here in the corner.
I just had an aside for Matthew. It was my understanding that during the 50s and 60s, China was such a closed society that the American intelligence agencies couldn't get any on-the-ground information out of China. So what they learned was that the fish were wrapped in newspapers. So all of a sudden, they started buying a lot of fish just to get a hold of the newspapers to find out what was going on in China's society.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. They also were heavily reliant on British intelligence as well. I mean, they like to tell the stories about the fish thing, but it's not as romanticized as that. There is a large CIA presence in Hong Kong. I've known this because I used to do research on the British mission in Beijing, and also the Swiss were very helpful as well. So I wouldn't want us to think that America was doing a kind of casual operation. It was a very sophisticated form of surveillance. It's also interesting that China was only closed to its enemies. It was very open to all of its friends, of which it had many at that time. And so these were also channels for information. And certainly if you want to research printing in China in the 50s and 60s, that kind of foreign observation is very useful.
I think Megan has a question here.
My question is for Elisa. I'm really interested in the receipt books you showed that were folio and some which were very elaborately decorated with, there was some calligraphic pen work, which was really beautiful. And I'm wondering if that suggests to you that some of these books were made for presentation or display or purposes other than kind of utilitarian domestic use.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many were used for display and how many were used practically, like in the same way we would use cookbooks today. It's unclear if they're merely aspirational or they are practical. Certainly with the folios, they seem more aesthetic or aspirational. I think that there was probably an aspect of like this was part of growing up. Girls were taught to make these books by their mothers, and that's why you see those sort of narratives within them, like in the case that I showed you. So I think that was part of their getting ready to operate their own household, was producing a receipt book in the same way that their mother had produced a receipt book. And some are more elaborate than others. But part of doing this broader study and looking at 125 examples is to get a better sense of how many were aspirational or decorative and how many were actually practically used, and hopefully the biocodicology aspect will help illuminate that.
That's really great. And we have another question here.
Thank you very much for 3 really stimulating papers. I'm struck by the ways in which traditional bibliography, or for example, work on the first folio, then ends up informing the ways we think about the transition from print to digital media and the forms of remediation that we're seeing in art, in mass communication, and other places. Do you, the 3 of you, in the private kind of space of recipe recording and writing, or in mass communication in China, or in the poetics of someone who is using an older technology to create art, do you feel that it's worth assimilating things like bibliography on books in the early modern period to something much wider, which is really a history of media? And I mean, that's a very rich field, and your work makes me feel like these are in communication with each other. But I did want to hear from you about whether you feel that's a productive move and how whether it's been important to you.
I could only say, yeah, I think it's very productive. because my fellow graduate students in communications, I'm not overly familiar with the whole of the communications field, but still very interested in discourse and discourse analysis and reception. But say bibliography's interest in production, how information is manufactured and disseminated, how it's made legible. This is very exciting, and in the case of Mao's China, this coming in from a different angle really yields some quite startling conclusions. I think that transition to digital media as well is interesting because there's somebody at Stanford working on the Chinese computer, and for Chinese typesetting, any form of computerizing is like the holy grail of typesetting because it makes things a lot easier. And so even in this period, China is looking a lot towards the kind of digital revolution happening in Japan and in the United States and elsewhere, and thinking about how can this technology be applied to state communication. And now if you look at it, they've really got it down to a T. That state communication is very effective now by using the internet and other things.
I'm not really sure what to say other than I've drunk the bibliography Kool-Aid, and I think everyone else should as well. I think that, you know, as digital bibliography methodologies become more prevalent and are further developed, that bibliography will become popular again, and at least I certainly hope that that's true.
I would concur with that, and I think that, you know, working on something that is so contemporary, I feel like people in my area are not, like, their immediate impulse is not to do bibliographical inquiry of the works that we do, but I think that that's really a rich line of inquiry for these kinds of books, and so I feel like moving forward, what we'll see is a really interesting mix of kind of the traditional bibliography with new media and digital work, because traditional bibliography has so much to offer, and the ways in which it points our attention to aspects of work that we wouldn't otherwise be attentive to, especially things that we are so familiar with that we don't think about them. So that was something that's really fascinating to me about photocopying, because I feel like everybody in this room has made a photocopy, I think, and, you know, it's like, you know, why would we be interested in that? But there is this other history there if you start, you know, pulling at it and thinking about, you know, what does it mean for a book to be put together in this way.
Thanks, and I think we can just take one more because we have a break coming up, but Dyke?
To what extent was paper allocated to those that would be most consistent with the central government's views and less to those that might be a little bit off-center?
That's interesting. Because all publishers are under the state umbrella, deviation from the party line is not acceptable. So there was, you know, no renegade publish. Those had all been stamped out in the 50s. But you could be pro-Chairman Mao, or you could be very pro-Chairman Mao. And say, for example, Shanghai People's Press, which is and was a massive publisher, are doing slightly better than Beijing because they have contacts with the Shanghai municipal bureaucracy, who are on the most left wing of the party at that time and who say all the right things. And so Shanghai gets backdoor allocations that turn up in the middle of the night, so to speak. So it does help to be demonstrative of political commitment, certainly.
There is a break, so you will be able to discuss any additional questions you have with our new scholars. And I hope you'll agree that the New Scholars Program is really a wonderful way to bring attention to new areas of research in the area of bibliography and book history. I want you to join me in honoring Michael Winship for his forward thinking in creating this program in the 1990s. It was Michael's idea to form the New Scholars, an idea supported by Roger Stoddard, who was the president then. But Michael's here, and I'm going to embarrass you, Michael. Thank you. And And once again, for remembering two remarkable women who made this possible as well, and that's Marianne Malkin and Catherine Pantzer. Thanks again for joining us. I hope to see you at the rest of the program today.